Today's guest is Carla Denyer. She's been co-leader of the Green Party since 2021 and, since this year's election, MP for Bristol Central. She studied mechanical engineering at St Chad's College, Durham, and worked for a wind energy consultant in Bristol before moving into politics. She became a Green councillor in 2015 and joint leader of the party with Adrian Ramsey in 2021. In her maiden Commons speech in July, she made it very clear that the Greens won't be straightforward cheerleaders for the new government, but will push them to move faster on climate issues. Carla Denyer, welcome to Oh God, What Now? And congratulations on entering Parliament.
Thank you.
Are you enjoying it so far?
Yes, although it's very intense. There's so much to do. It's kind of a strange system in this country in that you get elected as an MP and you have to be doing the job immediately, unlike in the European Parliament or in the US, where newly elected members have some time to get their office set up. So you're having to simultaneously make speeches in Parliament, hire your staff, do all the training all at once.
You don't have like an onboarding scenario.
Well, there is, but you have to do all the other things at the same time.
So you joined Parliament at an absolute watershed time, at the end of 14 years of largely untrammeled Conservative power, during which time the environment's been seriously damaged, the NHS has been left underfunded, wages have stagnated. What do you see as the role for the Greens in the new Parliament? Because you're not exactly the opposition, but you're no longer a single MP. You're not like a sprinkling of, sort of minor figures on the fringes.
Yeah, well, we're really pleased with our results in this election. We've quadrupled our representation in the House of Commons, and that follows a more than quadrupling of our number of councillors elected at a local level over the last 5 local elections. So although we're not a huge party yet, we're pleased with that level of growth, and we will be looking in this Parliament to hold the Labour government to account. There are some things that they have proposed or already done that we've long campaigned for and we support, like lifting the de facto ban on onshore wind, proposing to bring the rail companies back into public ownership. That's something I've personally campaigned for a long time as well. But there are other areas where we think they're not going far enough on climate, as you mentioned, but also on inequality. Lifting the 2-child benefit cap, for example, is something that I've long argued is a no-brainer, would be an actually quite cheap as government interventions go, change that the Labour government could make that would lift hundreds of thousands of kids out of poverty immediately and lessen the poverty for many hundreds of thousands more. And I think the case is really compelling, and I think a lot of people are really disappointed that the Labour government have not only ruled out doing that, but kicking MPs out of their parliamentary party, suspending them for 6 months for suggesting that they should. And so I think that really shows the strength of having a handful of Green MPs in the Commons chamber who can make that case, who are emphatically not whipped by Keir Starmer and can hopefully pull them in the right direction on a few issues.
You increased your vote by more than 1 million votes this time. It came to 1.8 million, the most the Greens have ever had, and you doubled your share to 6.4% of the national vote, as well as winning 4 MPs. It's quite a long way from sort of European levels of power where you're able to, Greens in those countries are able to enter coalitions and affect policy, but it's not insignificant. Do you now have to face the issue of shifting from being kind of like a pressure group with a foothold in Parliament to being an actual parliamentary party with issues of whipping and issues of portfolios and issues of shadowing and things like that?
I'd slightly take issue with you describing the Green Party as a pressure group before. Mm-hmm. Our theory of change has always been to get Greens elected directly into the Commons and into town and city halls across the country to directly put forward the policies that we know this country needs, although we recognise that Greens getting an increased vote share does have a secondary benefit of putting pressure on other parties to do the right thing. But this is, I'm sure it'll take some adjusting, having 4 times as many MPs, but this is what we've been aiming for. We're pleased to be in this position. In terms of whipping, the Green Party actually takes a different approach here. And it's not just the fact that we only had 1 MP before this election. On principle, the Green Party does not whip its elected members. So that's the practice that we follow on local councils as well. We trust our elected members to vote according to their conscience. Of course, if you're a member of the Green Party, you're sharing a set of common values and sharing broadly support for the same set of policies. But we trust our members that their conscience or their need to represent their constituents as well as party policy, or simply their analysis of the relative benefits of or disbenefits of different aspects of what the government is putting forward might cause them to weigh it up slightly differently. My experience as a local Green councillor in Bristol for 9 years is that we voted together on almost everything, but occasionally a few members of the group might vote differently or abstain because they had a particular perspective, and that's respected.
Yeah, it's not going to work in Parliament, though. I mean, obviously, you've got 4 MPs, so it's not, you're not managing a mass of people. But the closer you get to, a larger parliamentary presence, the more you may find yourself having to adopt the tried and tested methods of the old parties.
Well, I was a member of a group of 24 Green councillors on Bristol City Council, and we managed fine without whipping there. I actually used to be the whip of my local Green councillor group, the not whip, because although we don't whip as in tell people how to vote, that role was still needed because the other parts of the whip role in Parliament as well is negotiating with other parties about who you're putting on which committee, opportunities to speak, procedure for what's going to be on the agenda for certain meetings, that kind of thing. And so I did that. And as whip, I also did some of the legwork of researching and suggesting how we might vote. At the time, I would describe it as I don't have a whip, but maybe I have a rolled up bit of newspaper in that I would just gently cajole my colleagues into suggesting a way forward, but they weren't going to get any heavy consequences if they didn't do it. It would more be that I was the one doing the legwork of, well, here's what Green Party national policy says. Here's what the Labour administration on the council is proposing. Here's where they agree. Here's where they differ. I think on balance we should vote for this, but we should mention where we think it's not going far enough in their speech. But sometimes a colleague might think, no, that's a red line for me. I can't vote for it, for example.
Rolled up bit of recycled paper rather than newspaper, I don't want to take the shine off your victory, which was a real achievement. And I know electoral politics is winner takes it all. Is there a bit of you that maybe regrets that your win had to come at the expense of Thangham Debonair, who's widely admired, was set up to be a really good culture secretary? Obviously, you fight the constituency where you've got your roots, you fight to win. There's a little twinge, maybe, that Thangham Debonair had to be the person that you beat?
Yeah, I've always been really clear that I hugely respected her work. She was a very hard-working constituency MP, and of course I was a councillor in her constituency for her whole time as MP, so interacted with her in her office quite a lot. It was nothing personal targeting that seat. It's where I've lived for nearly 15 years, and it was a seat that the Greens had a very good chance of winning because of how we'd done in local elections and generally the popularity of Green policies in that area. To be honest, if we had a proportional voting system, which I and the Green Party support, then we might have constituency boundaries being different and or multi-member constituencies, which could have meant that Thangham and I could have both been MPs. But because the Labour Party officially doesn't support proportional voting, and as far as I can tell, Thangham has stayed pretty quiet on whether she supports it or opposes it, it's Labour's resistance to a fair voting system that prevents that being possible, along with preventing us having a system where the number of MPs from each party matches the number of votes cast for them.
You could also find yourself sharing a constituency with a Reform MP as well, though. So you never know which way these things can go.
Not very likely in Bristol.
Depends how big the constituency is, I guess. I want to ask you a bit more about the government's green plan, because obviously this is a huge focus for you. Labour has promised zero carbon electricity by 2030. Coal is almost gone as a power source in this country. The party said they double wind capacity on land, quadruple it offshore and triple solar power. But they have dropped the £28 billion green commitment. They did that quite early in the campaign. You've called their plans pretty timid. Give us your sort of overview on what Labour's doing on green stuff in particular.
I think what you just said there is a good summary, and my goodness, it's such a relief compared to the last 14 years of the Conservatives increasingly giving in to the culture war that's attempting to dismantle the cross-party consensus on climate change. So at least we now have a government in power who recognises that the climate emergency is an emergency and we need to do something about it urgently. However, as you said, Labour U-turned on their previously flagship 28 billion climate investment pledge. And in place, the investment in Great British Energy is just 8.3 billion across the whole 5-year Parliament. So that doesn't really touch the sides compared to what they were saying before. And the 28 billion that was previously their promise, that wasn't that wasn't just from them. Independent sources were saying that was really the floor of what was needed in terms of climate investment to get to net zero. So it was already the bare minimum, and then they abandoned even that. And while the targets they've announced around a rollout of renewable energy is really welcome, and of course, as a former renewable energy engineer that worked in offshore wind specifically, I really welcome that. Electricity is, to some extent, the low-hanging fruit. That is the relatively easy stuff to decarbonise. It is buildings, especially the heating of our homes, and transport that are the tricky ones. Those are the ones that are proving hard to decarbonise in the UK so far, and where I think there is a greater role for government intervention to speed up the process. And that's why, as the Greens, we have for years been pushing the previous government and now this government to roll out a nationwide home insulation programme, because that would bring down carbon emissions and bring down people's bills and give them warmer, more comfortable homes that's better for their health and therefore has lots of knock-on benefits like reducing the impact on the NHS. And that is the kind of area where a government intervention could make a big difference. And if local government had the powers and the funding to roll that out, to give households that need it direct financial support, grants, give middle-income households a blend of grants and access to affordable property-linked finance to make those changes. And of course, it would directly be council's responsibility to make changes to council homes. A change like that could make a huge difference, not just to the climate, but also to our quality of life every day.
The Green Party has got very deep cultural roots, not just in sort of present-day climate science, but going right the way. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when it was called the Ecology Party. That's how ancient I am. And there is, within the kind of corpus of green thought, there is a bit of a kind of, there's a suspicion of large infrastructure development, which we're probably going to need in order to decarbonise. In your exchange with Ed Miliband, which after your maiden speech, he said, if the Green Party wants to tackle the climate crisis, it should know that it simply will not happen if its leading members say no to new energy infrastructure. Your co-leader, Adrian Ramsey, has called for a pause on a proposed 114-mile pylon route across East Anglia. Green councillors have often opposed solar farms. How do you see, is there a task of sort of combating NIMBYism amongst some Greens in that, like, we want to decarbonise the economy, but we don't want to build the things that will make that possible?
That's a little bit of a misrepresentation of what's going on there. So first of all, boring technicality, Ed Miliband's comments there weren't in response to my maiden speech. Okay. They were in response to a question I asked him about Great British Energy and whether he recognised that it would be a good idea for at least some of Great British Energy's projects to be ones where they had entirely publicly owned, or at least a majority publicly owned stakes, so that they had a controlling stake. Because I was concerned that if they're just having 5 or 10% stake in a load of privately run projects, how much influence is the government really having? And Ed Miliband didn't really answer my question and instead went on the attack, spreading some pretty misleading misinformation, I would say, about my co-leader, Adrian. He has spent his whole career campaigning to accelerate the rollout of renewable energy as the CEO of 2 environmental charities and as an environmental campaigner since he was in school. For 25 years, he's been campaigning successive Labour governments as well as Conservatives to roll out renewable energy more quickly. And Adrian is absolutely not opposed to infrastructure. And I don't really recognise the description of the Green Party being sceptical of infrastructure. But what the Green Party and the wider Green movement does say is that decisions like that around new developments, whether they are housing or renewables or infrastructure, they should take into consideration local concerns, and they should be sensitive to those and be ready to tweak them in response to feedback they get. And that's, I think that's what most Brits believe. I think most Brits would want their elected representatives, when they're confronted with a decision about a planning application, to take into consideration the specific merits of that application rather than making a blanket all pylon routes are wonderful, doesn't matter how, where they go, who they impact, how much it impacts. So with that route in East Anglia, in response to earlier rounds of feedback, National Grid has already agreed to put certain parts of the route underground, where they're particularly ecologically sensitive. And as a hardworking constituency MP, Adrian has been supporting residents to give further rounds of feedback in the consultation, which closed late last week. I think that's what people expect their MPs to do. And the reason I think that Ed Miliband's comments were particularly egregious and misleading is that earlier in the same debate, in response to questions from other MPs, he had said the same points that I've just said and that Adrian has been saying all along. That, of course, the Labour government doesn't want to have a blanket yes to literally any application that any developer wants to make. Of course, we have to make case-by-case decisions. That's all Adrian's arguing for, and that's all local Greens are arguing for, is just to make sure that we bring people along. Because the fastest way to roll out the infrastructure we need to have this renewable energy revolution is to make sure that we bring people along with us.
But you can understand how people are surprised when they see Green councillors objecting to solar farms.
Well, you said something like Greens are objecting to solar farms all the time. Have you actually?
Well, there's several examples of local councillors saying we don't want it in this area.
I've only had 3 put to me. Mm-hmm. We've got over 800 Green Party councillors. On most councils, there's a planning committee every 2 or 3 weeks. Typically 6 planning applications go to each planning committee. There might be between 1 and maybe 4 Green councillors on each committee. So what's that? I can't do the mental maths. But that Greens must have voted on tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of planning applications in the last few years. So, of course, if you are a campaigner that wants to try and undermine and campaign against the Green Party, I am sure you are going to be able to find 2 or 3 examples of Green councillors voting against renewable energy projects. There's one that I know about because I spoke to one of the councillors involved, and it was a planning application for a solar farm in a nature reserve. And Green councillors and councillors from other parties voted against it on the basis that there was a suitable site that wasn't a nature reserve nearby, and they suggested it should go there instead. And my understanding is that is now what's happening. So, it's a wonderful clickbaity headline, but if you actually look into the detail is Greens make a sensible decision taking into consideration the specific local impacts.
We've just seen Rachel Reeves cancelling an awful lot of infrastructure work this week. Not just the Stonehenge tunnel, which I'm going to guess you're not in favour of.
That's right. And in fact, I think it was partly a Green MEP, Molly Scott-Cato, in the southwest, who was part of the campaign challenging that at the time. Yeah,
but also the £85 million Restoring Our Railways scheme, which would be in accord with Green policies. £85 million quid, not actually all that much money in national terms, but do you feel that the kind of very draconian decisions that are being made by the Treasury now, Labour would say, out of necessity because of the mess they've been left, is it being connected with the needs of the reconstructing the country in such a way that it will preserve green targets?
I think you're exactly right. Scrapping the investment in railways to reopen railway lines and stations especially is so counterproductive, because it's exactly that investment that will not only help us to decarbonise our transport system and unblock our transport system as well, help to get people out of congested traffic jams and so on. It'll also help our economy, because if people are stuck in a traffic jam, they're not being as productive. So I think it is really short-sighted. And I think that Rachel Reeves' line that's been repeated this week, but they've been repeating for months, that there is no money, is pretty misleading, because we are still in one of the richest economies in the world. There is plenty of money in our economy. The problem is that it's incredibly unequally distributed. During and since the pandemic, the very, very richest in our society, the billionaires, got richer by billions more pounds. And yet, at the other end of the spectrum, we had more and more people pushed into poverty. We had people in full-time work, people like nurses having to use food banks. The Greens are clear that that's not acceptable, and that if the Labour government wanted to, it could choose to bring in policies that would fix this. So during the election campaign, we talked about three main changes that we would make to the tax system. Introduce a wealth tax, which would only apply to billionaires and multimillionaires. And even then, it's a pretty modest tax. It's 1% on your wealth above 10 million. So your first 10 million is free.
Oh, that's great.
Rising to 2% for billionaires.
Yeah.
And then equalising the level of capital gains tax with the level of income tax. Capital gains is only paid by about 1.5% of taxpayers in this country, and that's overwhelmingly the very richest. And then fixing the loophole in national insurance that means that the highest earners pay a lower percentage towards national insurance than the rest of us. Those three changes, all of which are fixing a current inequality in the system, would collectively raise 50 to 70 billion pounds a year by the end of the next Parliament. And yet Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, has explicitly ruled out all three. And so when she says that they can't afford to lift the two-child benefit cap, she says that they can't afford to invest in infrastructure that will benefit us all, she is not being entirely honest.
I want to ask you about water, a key Green theme for years, and hugely important at the election. 26% of people told Ipsos that it was going to determine their voting choice. I mean, obviously, you're in Bristol, which has deep Green pedigree and has for years. But as you're campaigning nationally, did you notice that in particular cutting through more than it had before? We
did, yes. And I think the Green Party's approach that, of course, regulation and better enforcement would help with the sewage in our waterways. But ultimately, we think that it's time the government recognised that the privatisation experiment with water companies has failed. Since the water companies were privatised a few decades ago, they have got themselves into a huge amount of debt. And that amount of debt, funnily enough, is about the same amount that they've paid out to shareholders and CEOs in bonuses, and is not far off the amount they should have been investing in infrastructure. So it's easy to see what the solution to this could be, especially because it's a natural monopoly. If you live in the southwest, in Bristol as I do, you can't choose to be supplied by Yorkshire Water. So there's no competition that is sometimes the argument given for a privatised system. You have to use the supplier that covers your area. So we've got shareholders and CEOs creaming off profits rather than investing in the infrastructure. When it's clearly a public service, it should be in public hands, run for the public good. And we know from independent polling from, I've seen it shared by the campaigning group We Own It, but I think other pollsters as well, has showed that there is a consistent large majority of Brits that think that water companies should be in public hands, including a majority of people that voted Conservatives in 2019. So it's not even a remotely party political issue. It's just something that people see as common sense. And I think that did drive a lot of people towards the Greens, including in Waveney Valley and North Herefordshire, where we won two of our new seats with my co-leader Adrian and my colleague Ellie Chowns. Both of those very rural constituencies, previously Conservative areas, and both with the river, the Waveney and the Wye, running through them and quite a pivotal part of the local community.
So that's really interesting because they're sort of, one would imagine, in the old days, natural Tory constituencies. You've just described renationalisation, wealth tax. You've also talked about scrapping university fees, stopping the creeping privatisation of the NHS, ending new oil and gas licences. The party's been very strong in its support for Palestine on the whole Gaza issue. You're hoovering up votes in Conservative constituencies, but are the Greens kind of essentially a party of the left now? You're to the left of Labour on lots of things, more than a single issue party of the environment. You're a party of, the reforms you described there of tax, not really very much to do with the environment. Are you a party of the left now?
Those, almost all of the policies you just listed, we've had as our policies for 20 years plus. So this isn't a new thing. The Green Party has always been about fairness and creating a fairer country as well as a greener country. And in fact, one of the reasons I joined the Green Party was that I realised that they shared my values and my understanding of climate justice and social justice being two sides of the same coin, and we have to tackle them together. And I might argue, feminism and racial justice and so on as well. in a way that other parties, I don't think, do see it like that. The other parties see the environment as a bolt-on extra that far too often they abandon when the going gets tough. And so the Green Party's approach, I think, resonates with an increasing number of people. I talked about the level of public support for public ownership of water. Some of those other policies you listed, there's majority British public support for introducing a wealth tax. I can't remember which pollster it was, but they very conveniently, the way the polling question was phrased, described almost exactly the same as what the Greens is proposing, with the cut in at the same levels, and that had majority public support. A ceasefire in Gaza, which the Greens have been campaigning for a long time, that's consistently had around 75% Brits supporting it. And so there's so many policy areas where the majority of Brits agree, regardless of who they voted for in the last election or where they live, and yet often the Greens the only ones offering those policies. And so I think my impression from that and from thousands of conversations on doorsteps is that many voters already know that they agree with the Green Party on policies. And the reason that they hadn't previously voted Green is that they thought we couldn't get in. They were afraid that it would be a wasted vote. Whereas now, having more than quadrupled our number of councillors in the last 5 local elections and now quadrupled our number of MPs, and come second in a further 40 constituencies in this election, more and more people are seeing that if they want those Green Party policies that are about the environment and fairness, they can vote Green and they've got a good chance of getting a Green elected.
So it's more than peeling off support from the Labour left for people who are done with Starmer. You think that these policies are popular across the board?
I think they're resonating with a lot of people, and the Green Party is its own political philosophy. We're not the outriders of any other political parties, and that's when people compare us with Reform. I think that's one of the points I'd like to point out. Reform exists to influence the Conservatives, as far as I can tell. That is very much not the case with the Greens. We exist to get Greens elected and get stuff done.
So there's not going to be an election for a very long time.
Maybe.
We think, probably. Who knows? Who can plan anything these days? But sort of looking forward, what's your message, say, to somebody, to that kind of mythical centrist voter who's gravely concerned about the climate, sick of seeing the state of their local river, maybe thinks that water and rail and other sort of natural monopolies should be in public hands, but it's also simultaneously broadly pro-economic growth and fine with the private sector and those things that don't sort of fit into a kind of traditional left-right continuum. If the policy platform that you did so well on has obviously got broad appeal, but a lot of it is sort of would probably be characterised as left. What do you say to that kind of vote, that mythical centrist voter who maybe looks at the Green Party and thinks you've got a lot of things that they like, but that the party is fundamentally not about growth and is not going to deliver that kind of thing maybe that the country needs? On
growth, first of all, I think the best way of explaining the Green Party's approach is that there are some areas of the economy that definitely need to grow. There are some areas of the economy, the high carbon bits, that need to shrink. And rather than being totally pro or anti-growth, all the other parties are sort of unquestioningly pro-growth, our approach is that gross domestic product, GDP, is a terrible measure of how the country is doing. If more people get cancer, GDP goes up. If there's a horrible pile-up on the M25, GDP goes up because of all the insurance claims and all the repairs that have to happen and all of the operations in hospital. If we go to war, GDP goes up. In fact, Russia's GDP has been doing very well recently because their factories have been making lots of military uniforms and weapons. But those military uniforms go on people that then go out to war and don't come back. Is that a measure of the country doing well? I don't think so, and I don't think most people think so. So our approach is that measuring the growth in GDP is a terrible way of measuring how the government is doing and how the country is doing as a whole, and we would rather a measure that captures health, well-being, happiness, whatever you want to call it. There are some countries that are experimenting with this.
I seem to remember David Cameron flirted with this, didn't he, very early on?
Yeah, well, which I think is another sign that this isn't, necessarily a lefty opinion. I think it's quite a common sense opinion. Measure what you actually want to improve. Don't measure a proxy that isn't actually a very good proxy for what you want to happen.
Okay. if we have this conversation, let's say in 2028, on the verge of the next election, what will a successful term look like for you as you're looking to double your vote again and quadruple your MPs again?
Are you going to get me back on and play the recording back to me?
Delighted to have you back. It's a date. I've got to put it in the calendar right now.
Great.
What will a successful term look like for the Greens?
So my priorities, broadly speaking, as an MP, are going to be to push the government on climate, to try to get more urgent action, but also more climate justice, by which I mean making sure that those with the broadest shoulders who can afford to pay a bit extra and those that are most responsible for historic carbon emissions are contributing most to the solutions, and those on the lowest incomes that haven't contributed very much get the support to transition to cleaner vehicles, insulating their homes and so on. So fast but fair climate transition, tackling the housing crisis, which is a particular issue in my constituency in Bristol Central, where nearly half the people live there are in the private rented sector, and rents have spiralled absolutely out of any relationship to incomes. There's a whole generation, it's nearly 2 at this rate, that are going to be stuck in the private rented sector forever. So we need to do something about that. And we've got the ideas. And making the case, as we were earlier in this discussion, about the value of investing properly in your public services. And if that means making tweaks to the tax system to make it fairer, then that's what the government should do. So those will be the broad themes that you will hear from me again and again over the next few years.
We are in the future. It's 2028.
Yes. Yeah. In the more immediate term, when myself and my 3 fellow Green MPs came up to Parliament for the first time, we put out a statement about what we thought the government could and should get done in its first 100 days, because there's so much low-hanging fruit that they could be getting on with now. And so that was things, you've already heard us talk about some of them, things like lifting the 2-child benefit cap, lifting the de facto ban on onshore wind. Hurrah, that one's happened. But there's other quick wins they could do on renewables, like making solar panels default on all new homes, unless there's a very compelling reason why not. Because we, or rather private developers mostly, are still building houses now that are energy inefficient because the regulations are lax. And that means that we're building houses now that will immediately need to be retrofitted. And retrofitting is much more expensive and inconvenient, especially once someone's living in the house, obviously, than just building it right the first time around. So we do need that nationwide home installation programme. But something the Labour government could do right now is just change the planning rules so that solar panels on every roof. It's common sense. It's pretty much universally popular. Let's just do it.
It's very strange. It's only a year ago that Labour just lost the Uxbridge by-election by a sliver, and it was pinned on Sadiq Khan's ULEZ. And it sort of was reported as if, well, that's it for green policies. People want their cars, get rid of ULEZ. And within a year, I was particularly annoyed at how quickly Labour seemed to fold on that. And then in a year's time, we've had an election that's been hugely defined by green themes. Are you optimistic at the rate at which things change quickly these days?
I'm glad that to hear the way you described the Uxbridge by-election, because that was my take as well. And I saw a lot of hot and not very accurate takes from some journalists saying, oh, Labour failed to win this by-election. That must mean everyone hates the climate.
Everybody hates the planet, yes.
And that is an interesting take, given that it was a formerly safe Conservative seat that was always going to be a long shot for Labour to win it, 1. 2, the Labour parliamentary candidate also opposed ULEZ, so this wasn't a proxy referendum about ULEZ, which is its own problem, by the way, that Labour, again, as I mentioned before, that tendency to abandon the bolt-on environmental policies as soon as the going gets tough. It was unpopular locally, so this Labour parliamentary candidate threw Sadiq Khan under a bus and said, I don't support Sadiq Khan's ULEZ policy, which I'm sure that went down like a lead balloon.
Well, when his dad's a bus driver, it's pretty cruel, isn't it?
Yeah. So I agree with your take that Labour failing to win that by-election does not mean everybody hates the climate. And we know that clean air, clean water, as well as reducing carbon emissions matters to a lot of people. I seem to have a bee in my bonnet about polling today, but polling, again, consistently shows that the public are ahead of the Conservatives and Labour, and they want governments to go faster on climate. And so that's the value of having this handful of Green MPs in Westminster now, that we can push the government to be bolder on the areas where they're being a little bit timid.
Carla Denyer, it's been fantastic talking to you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.